The row rages on about whether Rachel Reeves misled the public.
We now know the black hole was fake, her book was fake, her CV was fake, even her chest claims are made up. She doesn't belong in the Treasury, she belongs in La La Land.
How much trouble is the Chancellor in a week on?
I have very rarely lived through quite such a shambles.
Farage accused of racism when he was a schoolboy.
He regularly would come up to me and say, Hitler was right.
How politically damaging are the allegations, which he denies?
He might emerge stronger if he sort of owned it, apologised and moved on, but he's refusing to own it. He'll say he's not owning it because it's not true. I don't know how convinced people are by that.
Hello and welcome to Talking Politics. I'm Paul Brand.
And I'm Robert Peston.
Now, it's a week on from the budget, but pressure continues to mount on Rachel Reeves. To remind you, she's been accused of misleading the public about how bad the public finances were in the weeks leading up to the budget, in order to justify policies she introduced to raise tens of billions of pounds of public money. Kemi Badenoch has called on her to resign again. Here she is at this week's PMQs.
We now know that the head of the OBR was forced out for telling the truth, that the Chancellor did not need to raise taxes on working people. If she was a CEO, she would have been fired, and she might even have been prosecuted for market abuse. That's why we've written to the Financial Conduct Authority. So will the Prime Minister ensure the Chancellor fully cooperates with any investigation?
Mr. Speaker, she's completely losing the plot. She clearly didn't read. May I pay tribute to Richard Hughes and his leadership of the OBR? He made very clear why he stepped down, and I've made very clear my support of the OBR. But she says take responsibility. Under this Chancellor, Mr. Speaker, growth is up this year, defeating and beating the forecast. Wages are up. More since the general election than in 10 years of the Tories. We've had, I think, 5 interest rate cuts. NHS waiting lists are down. We've had record investment into this country.
So, Robert, the big question, which I saw you trying to dig into earlier this week, is whether Rachel Reeves will resign and whether the fact that the head of the OBR, Richard Hughes, has resigned puts extra pressure on the Chancellor. What do you think?
Well, I certainly think that the resignation of Richard Hughes is broadly bad for the Chancellor because, he resigned because of incompetence at his institution, the Office for Budget Responsibility, as a result of the release of, frankly, every facet of the budget in their big budget book 45 minutes before the Chancellor was planning to disclose all that extraordinarily sensitive information, very important information. So he resigned, as I say, for the incompetence of the OBR, not because he had directly himself done anything wrong. And, as I said to the Prime Minister at his press conference on Monday, I have only, I've been covering budgets for decades. I think I think I've reported on something like 35 budgets, believe it or not. I have very rarely lived through quite such a shambles in terms of the preparations for this budget. And, if I'm right that the preparations were such a shambles, and if Richard Hughes had to resign, then it's not surprising to me that, particularly the Tories, even actually, frankly, 1 or 2 of Rachel Reeves' own colleagues on her own benches, think that she ought to, in a sense, do the honourable thing and resign. Now, she's denying that she did anything wrong or that the Treasury did anything seriously wrong. And at the moment, I see no sign of her going, for the very simple, hard politics reason that she has the full support of the Prime Minister.
And presumably if she goes, he's in trouble as well then. So you can start to unpick all the threads.
Well, I did say to him in that press conference, who's to blame for this shambles? Is it the Chancellor, or is it you? And the reality of sort of the history of relationships between chancellors and prime ministers is very often when a prime minister very often when a chancellor goes in controversial circumstances, the prime minister is seriously weakened and often fatally weakened. You only have to look at the order of events, whether it was, Lawson resigning ultimately. Geoffrey Howe, also a former chancellor, but at the time not chancellor when he resigned. But the resignations of Howe and Lawson directly contributed to the departure of Margaret Thatcher, and the relationship between Brown and Blair was always very fraught. It was always fraught. One of the reasons, though, that Blair didn't sack Brown was not only that he was a genuinely formidable chancellor, but also that he recognised how damaging that can be to the authority and security of a prime minister. In the end, of course, Brown did succeed in himself in forcing Blair out. So no prime minister likes to force out a chancellor, because they know how much that will weaken themselves. And I think that is especially true of this prime minister, because the sort of Labour project since they were elected is very much their joint project. I think if she's forced out for failure, as it were, it will seriously weaken him. So I don't expect him to force her out unless her position is made untenable by external factors, and Kemi Badenoch today did point to something that could make her position untenable, and that is that her shadow chancellor, her shadow chancellor Mel Stride, has written to the Financial Conduct Authority and demanded an investigation into whether the Treasury and the Chancellor created what's known as a false market. This is a city term, but false market in UK government bonds. Essentially whether you talked about how damaging it was that many people believe the public voters were misled. In terms of her position, what would be much more serious is if she had misled investors.
I mean, the amount of anger since the budget is extraordinary, really. I mean, on the one hand, the budget has just about managed to keep itself together, to hold itself together. It hasn't sort of unpicked itself like we've seen with previous budgets. But the overarching issue about whether she was honest about the financial situation the country's in before the budget has elicited a massive amount of reaction. Have you sort of got to the bottom yet? Do you think you're satisfied in your mind about what actually happened in the run-up? Do you think the Chancellor did mislead people, and what was the game plan? Was it to try and sort of, I don't know, slip through these increases in welfare spending in a way that she could kind of disguise, even though it was a sop to the backbenchers? She could present it as, the tax rises were necessary in order to shore up the public finances, rather than just being a direct source of funding for the increase in welfare spending. What was going on, do you think?
So I don't think myself that there was, some really devious, cunning plan to pull the wool over people's eyes about tax rises. I basically think there was just a series of mistakes, what you might call incompetence. And I think, it goes back to, I think she was genuinely very upset that the Office for Budget Responsibility decided to conduct this review of the supply side of the economy this summer.
Productivity review, right?
Yeah. So rather than the previous summer, because it meant that a sort of deficit that they were going to calculate an amount by which she was going to miss her fiscal rules was not available to her immediately after the general election, and only became available this summer. Now, I'll be completely clear, and I've said this actually even before the OBR conducted that review this summer. I personally think the Chancellor is not on solid ground in being angry with the OBR for conducting that review when they did. And the reason for that is straightforwardly is because the world and his wife in the economics business, and she is supposed to be in the economics business, knew that the OBR was way more optimistic about the outlook for productivity and growth than pretty much every other forecaster, and including, for example, the Bank of England. And when she was preparing her budget in 2024, her first budget, the prudent thing to have done, and her officials at the Treasury should have advised her to do this, was to put aside some rainy day money then, because it was obvious that at some point the OBR would conduct its review and would do the downgrade, right? So the idea that this just came out of a clear blue sky is rubbish, right? She should have seen it coming. But, okay, she apparently didn't see it coming, which in itself, some would say is not terribly impressive. And I think she was just really annoyed that there was, it turns out, revealed in the budget, £16 billion less in tax revenues for her than she had been expecting, right? And so the briefings all start at the end of September this year, that it's all absolutely awful and unfair. The previous government's lackluster stewardship of the economy meant that growth prospects for the UK were lower than she'd expected. The OBR had finally caught up. It had conducted its review. It's terribly unfair. There's this hole in the public finances, which frankly, at the time, the Treasury was briefing was of the order of 20 billion quid. Now, in the actual budget, it's less than that. It's 16 billion pounds, it turns out. But they were, systematically briefing that it was going to be more than 20 billion quid, right? Now, the thing that we didn't know, and then just to be clear, as a result of those briefings, we ran that story. Pretty much every media organisation ran that story because the Treasury was briefing this hole from the productivity downgrade, right? Now, the thing that we learned 2 days after the budget. So the budget's last Wednesday. Then on Friday, the Office for Budget Responsibility does this completely unprecedented thing. It publishes this letter to the Treasury Select Committee, which sets out precisely what the Treasury knew and when about its fiscal forecasts. And to be clear, it did that off its own bat. Okay, it just decided to publish that information. It wasn't in response. So one of the things that, for example, the Chief Secretary of the Prime Minister, a man called Darren Jones, said on the radio a couple of days ago, something which is not true. He said they published it because the Treasury Select Committee had asked for that information. Rubbish, right? The Office of Budget Responsibility wanted to put that in the public domain. And the reason they wanted it in the public domain is because they had been concerned that in the run-up to the budget for about 2 months, there was a lot of misinformation in the media and indeed being touted by city analysts about the hole in the public finances, that it was way bigger than was actually the case. And so what they then did is they set out in this letter that, yes, they had told the Prime Minister in August, right, that it was downgrading productivity by 0.3%. Yeah. And that at the beginning of September, they put numbers on what that would mean in fiscal terms, right? But it also disclosed that around the same time, and this was crystal clear, in information supplied to the Treasury, I think on October the 3rd, that hull was absolutely overwhelmed, right, by much greater revenues from the existing taxes. That because inflation and because wages were higher than the OBR had been expecting, when people get paid higher wages, they pay more income tax. When prices go up, VAT receipts go up, right? So the OBR said to the government, and they gave it to them in absolutely pounds, shillings and pence numbers at the beginning of October, that the £16 billion hole from the productivity downgrade was way more than offset by something like £31 billion of tax revenues from existing taxes. In other words, the net of both effects, there wasn't a hole, there was a surplus of the order of £15 billion. This is all information we've never had before from the OBR, completely unprecedented. In the course of October, they gave us their they told the public the numbers that they gave the Chancellor. Right, beginning of October, they said there was a small deficit, a small miss, as it were, in terms of the Chancellor's most important fiscal rule, which is that tax revenues should cover day-to-day spending. And they said that after the 5 years, at the beginning of October, they said there'd be a deficit of I think it was just over 2 billion. By the end of October, in the third iteration of this, they were actually saying there was a surplus, right? Not a hole at all, but a surplus of 4 billion. But at no point in October, when all these stories were running about this terrible black hole that was going to lead, again, this is all on the basis of Treasury briefings and government briefings in general, was likely to lead to her have to break a manifesto commitment and put up income tax. There was never this massive hole. Right, there was a surplus.
So if she knew all that, why did she go into the press conference and still insinuate that the numbers were dreadful and that she was going to have to put up taxes, mostly on the basis of the numbers? I mean, she wasn't going into that press conference saying, "Look, we've made a decision on the basis of our consciences. We've got to reduce child poverty. We want to scrap the two-child benefit cap. Therefore, I'm going to put taxes up to try and." As a difficult choice, but ultimately one that we believe is the moral choice to make. She went into the press conference really insinuating that we all had to be ready for tax rises because the numbers were bad. Why did she do that? That was misleading, wasn't it?
So we'd never had a press conference like this by a Chancellor ahead of a budget, and inevitably, when the Chancellor decides to hold a press conference like that, it creates an expectation among journalists and in the city that she is preparing us for very bad news, right? And I think at the time they were still working on a plan to put up the basic rate of income tax, which would have been very controversial because it would have breached Labour's election manifesto. The reason that they're working on the plan is because they'd had advice, which I think was good advice, that if she had put up the basic rate of income tax, yes, it would have caused a political furore. Yes, tourism and reform would have massively criticised the government for breaking the manifesto, but there would have been a very positive reaction in markets. Right, because those who lend to the government, who decide what essentially rate of interest to lend to the government, will lend to the government at a lower interest rate if they believe that this is a strong government making tough decisions. Right, and investors had been alarmed when the government had done that U-turn on cutting welfare as a result of a rebellion by Labour MPs, because they originally thought this was a strong government with an enormous majority, And then when they saw the way that Reeves and Starmer capitulated, they thought, actually, this is a weak government. Can't even control its own backbenchers. And so if she'd put up the basic rate of income tax, which would have been a simple way to raise money, those investors would have said, actually, they're a bit tougher than this is controversial, but they're doing a difficult, tough thing, right? And at that point, I think the price of government bonds would have risen very significantly, and the interest rate the government would have paid would have come down, right? Now, so I think that's what she was doing in holding that press conference, is in a sense creating a climate in which she could have done that. The problem for her is she didn't say any of that explicitly. She also, by implication, prepared the ground for something else that investors really like. Okay, so I'm just now going to take you through, because I think this is quite important, that people don't really understand this, what actually happened in terms of the big round numbers in the budget, because this will help to explain the mess that they got themselves into. Okay, so I said that in the last so-called pre-budget, I said that in the last so-called pre-budget measures forecast that was made by the Office for Budget Responsibility before the budget, there was a surplus of £4 billion, right? Now, that is not a lot of headroom, right? That is not that headroom, that surplus is what is sort of rainy day money. It's a cushion in case there's an economic shock, right? Now, typically between budgets, actually, the history shows you get really quite big swings. You get swings, if the economy grows a bit faster or slower, tax revenues, go up or go down. In the context of, public spending, taxes of, 1.5 trillion or something of that magnitude, of course there are going to be swings from budget to budget. And so you need to have some rainy day money, right? And she in her first budget had too little rainy day money, 9.9 billion, which had fallen to 4, right? Not a hole, not a deficit, but not enough. So one of the things she did, and this was the right thing to do, but it was expensive, is she doubled from 9.9 billion in the last budget to, more than double, to 22 billion pounds, her headroom, her rainy day money. And that was 17 billion pounds of extra money that she had to find. Yeah. Then because of her welfare U-turns, the fact that she backed off cutting disability benefits, the fact that she backed off means testing the winter fuel payment, right? That had cost her since the spring over 7 billion, right? So you've got 17 plus 7 takes you to 23, and then she had the 3 billion cost of abolishing the 2-child limit on universal credit. That takes you to 26 billion pounds. How much tax did she raise? 26 billion pounds. Now, if she had said in her press conference, I want to raise roughly 17 billion pounds of rainy day money, I want to build up the headroom by 17 billion, no one today could accuse her of misleading anybody. Right? Now, she said in her press conference, I want to be more prudent. But the mistakes that they made was they just conveyed everything that I've just said that she ended up doing seems to me to be a perfectly rational way to build a budget, right? Pushing up the headroom, having obviously to account for your welfare failures, as it were, and then as a result of pressure from Labour MPs, abolishing the 2-child limit, and actually most analysts would say that's an effective anti-poverty strategy. All of that makes sense. The problem is, right, that is not how she made the case in the autumn for putting up taxes by 26 billion. She put up those. She made the case for putting up taxes on the basis that, well, she basically tried to scare everybody that there was this big hole. Right? And there wasn't. What she should have done is simply said, I want to be a prudent Chancellor. I want to build up the headroom. This is the best way to get interest rates down in the long term. And if she'd done that, there'd be no complaint today. But she did this alarmist thing over a period of time, and that is why, frankly, one of the things that's very interesting is obviously, I spend quite a lot of time, if you do my kind of job, talking to journalists, right? One of the things that's very striking is how angry journalists from so many different media organizations are at the moment, because they just feel the Treasury misled them consistently. And losing the trust of journalists matters, losing the trust of investors matters. This is, this has been a really profoundly unimpressive performance by the Treasury over a period of weeks.
So, Robert, talking of politicians who are under pressure, Nigel Farage was under some this week. These allegations about what he did or didn't do when he was at school continue to keep cropping up. And this week, one of his former schoolmates or classmates, Peter Otegi, was on Good Morning Britain accusing Mr. Farage of racism when they were at school together. Let's have a listen to what he said.
He regularly would come up to me and say, Hitler was right. And he'd also come up to me and he'd go, gas them.
Are you Jewish?
Yes, I'm Jewish. I'm Jewish, yeah.
So he was specifically, you say, targeting you because you are Jewish with the most hurtful comments.
Yeah.
How old were you at the time?
I was between the ages of 13 and 14. And I should add, that's why, because it was a long time ago and we were very young, when I was first approached to talk about this back in 2013, I felt that it was an unfair thing to do. And it was only after Farage began denying it that I kind of thought, well, I've got to say something, because there's no way that he couldn't remember.
So Nigel Farage, we should make clear, told Good Morning Britain, I can categorically say that the stories being told about me from 50 years ago are not true. He also claimed that some of these stories have been politically motivated. I just wonder, looking at this from a kind of broad brush perspective, how damaging do you think they are for Nigel Farage? Do you think people still listen to these kind of stories about conduct, about politicians? Or do you think once they've opted to vote for a populist like Nigel Farage, they're kind of happy to go along with them, warts and all?
So, no, I do think that voters care about an individual's values. I think, in a way, the interesting thing for me about how Nigel Farage has responded is because it's not just Peter Otegi. There have been a number of other of Nigel Farage's contemporaries from Dulwich College, which is a fairly posh school he went to in South London. I think he's 60. We're talking about allegations about his alleged anti-Semitism, about alleged racist things that he said, 45 years ago, right? I mean, quite a long time ago. I think people sort of have two views. One is, most people, all anti-Semitism is wrong. But I suspect that people also believe that things that kids and teenagers say don't necessarily reflect. The things that kids and teenagers say don't necessarily reflect, an individual's values when they're 60. And so I think a lot of people, might think, well, if he was anti-Semitic, then,
maybe he's not now.
Maybe he's not now, and he's definitely worked with Jewish colleagues over the years. I think the bit that's odd about it is that he's decided to sort of approach it in two ways. Initially, when these allegations were made, the Guardian, for example, say that I think they've spoken to Pippa Carrera, who's on my show. We talked about it live on air last week. I think, the Guardian, I think, have testimony from, 15 different pupils at that school, all of whom saying that he said various forms of racist, toxic, anti-Semitic things. And
I suppose what Farage says is, why is it coming up now? You know,
a smaller number on the record. Well, I mean, it's politically motivated to the extent that he's, essentially, if the opinion polls are correct, set to be Britain's next prime minister. So there are quite a lot of people who just I think probably we need to know more about him. Now, the bit that I find slightly odd is, first of all, he said, teenagers say a lot of ridiculous and horrible things, but he claimed that he never said anything with the intention of hurting, so that was his first response. And if he said something inappropriate, it wasn't as it, intended to wound. He's now said that some of these charges against him are false. I said to Richard Tice, his deputy, on the show, I said, look, why on earth doesn't he just basically say, look, I can't remember everything, but if I said inappropriate things, I'm really, really sorry, and just apologise to these people. Essentially, Peter Ettigoy, who you referred to, says that he was really very hurt by what Farage said to him and I'm Jewish. I experienced anti-Semitism when I was a kid. These things stay with you, right? They don't go away. And the thing that is just odd about Farage's response is I think he might emerge stronger if he sort of owned it, apologised and moved on, but he's refusing to own it. Now, he'll say he's not owning it because it's not true, but I don't know how convinced people are by that.
Yeah. All right. Well, Robert, we'll see whether it does indeed damage his reputation, no doubt, in the run-up to next year's local elections, Wales elections, Scottish elections. Let's see what happens to Mr. Farage. That's it for this week's episode of Talking Politics. Thanks for listening. You can catch up wherever you get your podcasts. We'll be back next week.